We are in the fourth week of a sermon series that we are doing entitled 90. And the reason why we're calling it 90 is because for about the span of 90 days. Now, it's not exactly 90 days. I think it ends up being like 80 something, but 90 sounded cooler than 80 something. So we're calling it 90. And for 90 days, about the span of 90 days, what we're doing is we're journeying through the life of Jesus. And we're taking a look at some of his most significant encounters, some of his most significant conversations, and some of his most significant moments and events in his life. We're starting in the place where he was introduced as a man, as a teacher in the world, and then we're traveling through all the way to the place where he ends up giving his life as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Now, if you're here today and you don't consider yourself to be very religious, or if you're here and you kind of were a part of faith, but somewhere along the line you walked away from faith, or if maybe you were part of faith and then you walked away and you've come back, here's what I believe about you. I believe when you did that, if you're struggling with faith or if you walked away from it, that you probably had a good reason to do so. And the reason why I think you had a good reason to do so is I want to believe that for the most part, you're probably a reasonable person. And what I want to do this morning is give you just what I consider to be a good reason for you, because again, you're a reasonable person, to reconsider faith. But specifically, I want to give you what I think is a good reason for you to reconsider Jesus. So what we've been saying in this series is that Jesus came to introduce something brand new to the world, but not just brand new to the world. He came to introduce something brand new for the world. Jesus didn't come to extend something that was previously in place. He didn't come to repackage and rebrand Judaism so we could have a Judaism 2.0. And he also didn't come so that you and I could have two parts of the Bible, an Old Testament and the New Testament. He came to introduce something brand new into the world. And the thing that I think is amazing, that I think is just nothing short of incredible, is that after he died and then he was crucified and then buried and then he rose again, his followers, against all odds, a group of people who were branded by many people in the world at the time as Jewish blasphemers who were following a crucified teacher. His followers, a group of people that had no territory, no military, and in the beginning, no sacred texts, they went out into their world and they started declaring that the ultimate and final sacrifice for sins had been made. The ultimate and final sacrifice for everybody's sins, everywhere, for all time. And on top of that, they were telling people, look, because of that, because this happened on a hill just outside of Jerusalem, that animal sacrifice is no longer necessary. Now, you and I don't think much about that, but that flew in the face of every religion during Jesus' day. It flew in the face of Roman religion. It flew in the face of Greek religion. It flew in the face of Egyptian religion. It even flew in the face of Jewish religion. But these guys, they kept declaring this, and they had no territory, no military, no sacred text in the beginning, and people tried to shut them up. But no matter what, they would not stop talking about it. They would not stop telling people. Now, here's the incredible thing. About 350 years later, in AD 380, there was a Roman emperor by the name of Emperor Theodosius I who declared or had an edict written called the Edict of Thessalonica. In the Edict of Thessalonica, here's what it said, and here's what it meant. It meant that Christianity was declared to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. The official, 350 years later-ish, Christianity is now the official religion of the Roman Empire. The very empire that had Jesus crucified, and the very empire that tried to subsequently stamp out his movement now declares, no, this is now the sole religion of the empire. And this is unthinkable, I'm sure unthinkable, especially to John the Baptist, who first declared and introduced Jesus into the world. He's down at the Jordan River, large crowds of people have gathered, thousands of people are there. He's doing his thing. He's preaching, he's teaching, people are confessing their sins, and he's baptizing people. And the way I sort of picture it is maybe he baptizes somebody, and as he's bringing them out of the water, he looks up and he sees Jesus, and he introduces Jesus into the world, and here's how he tells them, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Now, I'm sure that when John said that, it was nearly like he didn't even have the framework to imagine a day when Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire. He had no concept, no framework to even picture a day when Roman temples would be dismantled or repurposed, and that pagan religion would be outlawed. And on top of that, ancient Judaism wouldn't even be possible. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let me kind of rewind a little bit. Previously on 90, here's what we've talked about. Jesus was introduced into the world by John, and then after that, you kind of expect him to go and start his ministry, but instead of that, he's led into the wilderness where he's tempted by Satan, and the core of the temptation there is for him to go back to the old that he had come to replace, and Jesus fights and he resists the temptation, and we get this sort of hint that this is an ongoing temptation, that Jesus would constantly, throughout the rest of his life, be tempted to go back to the old way. Now, after that, Jesus is introduced to some of his first followers. He meets Peter and James and John and Andrew, and he invites them to follow him. And that's where we pick up the story in Luke chapter 4. Here's what it says. News about him, we're talking about Jesus, news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. Now, the reason why they were praising Jesus is because they think he has come to extend the old. They think he's a part of the old that they are used to. He's this new, interesting teacher, and he's young and hip, and he's got these really cool illustrations, and he kind of comes at it from this sort of shock jock sort of approach, and it's jarring for them, but they kind of like it because it's new and different. In fact, they think he's more than just a good teacher. They think he's also a prophet. Because in the next verse we read, a great prophet has appeared among us. In other words, he's got to be from God somehow. And then don't miss this. God has, and this is what they believed about Jesus, that God has come to help, and don't miss this, his people. They think Jesus is there for them. They think specifically when they talk about his people, you know what they're talking about? They're talking about the nation of Israel. They think Jesus has come and he's this special sort of something and God's kind of working through him and it has to do with them. But the thing is that Jesus had come for a much, much broader audience than that and a much bigger purpose than that. So what Jesus starts doing in his teachings is he starts dropping clues and hints, kind of like breadcrumbs for people to follow so that they would understand, no, I'm here to do something new and I'm going to start something new, but people didn't get it. Even the more astute among his students that were following him didn't quite understand the clues and the hints that Jesus was leaving behind. So what Jesus does is when he gets to the Sermon on the Mount, he kind of ratchets things up a little bit. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is one of his most famous sermons. And in this sermon, he literally everything that he does is so upside down for them. It's so different from what they're used to thinking. Now, the interesting thing to me about the Sermon on the Mount, you may not know this, and I didn't know this until recently, is that what scholars tell us is they believe that this was actually content or a sermon that Jesus repeated over and over and over and over again. Probably over the course of about 6 to 9 months, almost every day, every time they sat down somewhere, Jesus would start doing the Sermon on the Mount, and his disciples were like, oh, I get it. Oh, yeah, we've done this. Heard this sermon before, you know. Can we move on? Can we do some different stuff? But Jesus kept doing it because he didn't want people to miss what he was trying to do and what he had come to accomplish. Now, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount starts with words that you and I are probably pretty familiar with. Probably chances are you've memorized them somewhere along the way, or maybe you have a mug at home with some part of it on it, or some of you might even have cross-stitched these into something at some point in time. But they're familiar to us, and they bring comfort to us. But to the people that Jesus was saying it to, these were extremely discomforting thoughts, because this was not what they were used to. This is not what they had been taught. Now, here's how Jesus starts off the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Some versions read the kingdom of heaven. Now, this is generally good news to us, but for them, this was upside down thinking. This is not the way the world worked. In their minds, they were raised in a worldview that taught them that God favored the rich, that if you were rich, that God was bestowing his favor on you. The poor people were the ones that lacked the favor of God. I mean, all their heroes of the faith were rich people. I mean, it's just the way they thought. Moses was rich, Abraham was rich, David was rich, Solomon was rich. And so in their mind, rich people were blessed and favored by God. But Jesus comes in and he goes, no, that's not the way that it works. And of course, if you're a poor person and you're hearing Jesus say these words, you're thinking, well, maybe God feels differently about me than I had thought. And maybe God thinks differently about me than my religious leaders have led me to believe and my community has led me to believe. Now from here, Jesus keeps saying these upside down, crazy statements that are so different than what they're used to. He goes on and he talks about how the meek will inherit the earth. And when Jesus' audience heard that, they're going, wait a minute, that's not the world works. That's not what we were taught. We were taught that meekness is not a value to be pursued or a character trait to have. And Jesus sort of subtly hints at him, look, meekness isn't weakness. It's power under control. And he starts talking about how the meek will inherit. And then the merciful will be blessed. And they're thinking, merciful? We're not taught mercy. And he continues and he talks about peacemakers rather than those who are strong and assert their power will be blessed. And then he finishes off this segment of his sermon this way. He says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And you and I, again, we're so familiar with that, but for them, this was mind-boggling stuff. For them, purity had to do with external things. There were foods they didn't eat and things they didn't touch and places they didn't go and ceremonial washings that they took part of. And for them, purity came from the outside. And all of a sudden, Jesus starts suggesting that that's not the way that it works. In the new he's about to bring, purity comes from the inside. And it has little to nothing, if nothing, to do with external things. And then he has the audacity to say that, look, it's the pure in heart that will see God. They'll actually experience him. They'll know his heart. They'll know his mind. They'll sense his presence and his movement and his purposes in this world in a way that other people simply will not get. And their minds are just being boggled by everything that Jesus is saying. This is turning their whole thought process on its head. So then Jesus does something. He leans in and tells them something that absolutely blows their mind. And here's what he says. You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. And they're hearing Jesus say these things, and they're thinking, like everybody? Like people who aren't different than us? People are different, like not just us, but everybody? Jesus, maybe you don't understand. Like everything we've been taught to do and everything we practice is separation from others. We don't like them. They don't like us. Like we don't go to their house. They don't come to ours. Our children don't marry their children. You mean we're the salt of the what? And the light of the what? So Jesus continues and he says, in the same way, let your light shine before others. And they're going, Jesus, others? Like non-Jewish others? Like we don't even like them. In fact, what we'd love to rise up with military might and power and drive them and every one of their descendants into the ground. And now you're telling us that this whole thing, it's not about us, it's actually about other people? Jesus, he continues, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And I know they're thinking, here's how they're thinking. They're thinking, forget glorify. Like, I'm not interested in them glorifying God. I want them to fear God. I want them to be afraid like they were back in the days of Joshua. So then Jesus, they're looking at Jesus and they're going, Jesus, this isn't what we've been taught. Like, this is nothing like what we've been taught. This doesn't even sound messianic. In fact, this sounds completely new. So then Jesus, here's what he says. He says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. Let me kind of stop here and explain some of what Jesus is saying. When Jesus says the law or the prophets here, what he's talking about is what you and I refer to as the Old Testament. For the Old Testament was a covenant between God and the nation of Israel, or a relationship agreement between God and the nation of Israel. It governed how God and that particular nation of Israel, engaged with and interacted with one another. And so Jesus says, look, don't get too wound up. I'm not coming to change it. I'm not coming to edit it. I'm not coming to add it. But why would Jesus feel the need to say this? Why would Jesus feel the need to say, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or prophets? Well, the reason why Jesus feels the need to say it is because that's what it sounded like to them. That's what it sounded like. They thought Jesus was saying that he had come to abolish that stuff. So Jesus continues, I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. In other words, look, here's the thing. You haven't completely misheard me. I have come to bring some change. Change is on its way. You kind of are starting to pick up some of this stuff I'm sort of laying down. Jesus was saying, look, if the old were a homework assignment, I've come to complete it. If we're a math problem, I've come to solve it. If we're a plane, I've come to land it. There's something coming. There's change. He continues. He says, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. In other words, he's saying, look, there's going to come a day where the old way of interacting with God and engaging God, the old way of worshiping God, some of the old mentalities that go along with it, there's going to come a day when everything is finally in its place, well, this will come to an end. And the amazing thing is literally about 40 years later, the very thing that Jesus predicted came true in August 6th, AD 70. August 6, AD 70 was the date when Titus, along with the 10th Roman Legion, came in and they destroyed the temple. And officially, ancient Judaism was no longer practiced because in order to practice it, you had to have a temple. It's incredible. Change was coming. Now, the essence of what Jesus is saying to the people who were listening that day is simply this. Jesus was born under God's covenant with Israel, the relationship agreement with Israel, to fulfill it, to end it, and to replace it. To replace it with something new that was not a covenant anymore between God and a particular people group, the nation of Israel, but now it would be a relationship agreement between God and everybody else. And Jesus is telling them, look, something new's coming. Something new's coming. Something new's coming. But just in case they missed it somehow, 6 different times Jesus makes these 6 different statements, and they all start this way. You probably heard them before, but here's how they go. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, but I tell you. 6 different times Jesus makes these statements that start with that. You've heard it said. In other words, you've heard people tell you. People have taught you. This is what you're used to hearing. And he would say, you know what? You've heard it said by people that you shouldn't murder, but I'm telling you, don't even hate. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you, don't lust. You've heard it said, and he would talk to the men when he said this because that's how it worked in their culture. You've heard it said that all you have to do is write your wife an official bill of divorcement and you're okay with God. And Jesus would come back and say, well, I'm telling you, not really. And these guys, their minds are getting boggled. So Jesus sort of summarizes it this way. Here's what he tells them. So in everything, and these are words that you and I know. We've quoted these words, haven't we? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. And what Jesus does here when he says this, he's sort of foreshadowing some of the new that he's about to bring. Something that would ultimately be less complicated, but more demanding. And we're going to talk about this later on in the series. You don't want to miss it. You don't want to miss it. So in Matthew 7:28, here's how it goes. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. In other words, the thing they were amazed about Jesus is he wasn't connected and anchoring himself to necessarily to the things that they had been taught by somebody who'd been taught, somebody who taught somebody who taught somebody who taught somebody throughout the years. Every other teacher they'd ever experienced taught based on the authority of the person who taught them. All of a sudden, Jesus arrives on the scene and he starts presenting these upside down concepts and thoughts and ideas, and he's doing it as if he actually has the authority to be saying those things. And this is mind-boggling. So they start to push back. Jesus, what about Moses? Jesus, what about the law? Jesus, what about the temple? And then Jesus says something to them that blows their minds. Here's what he says, and you and I, again, we've read this so many times, haven't we? But we rarely pay attention because we rarely understand the impact that it had on the people who were hearing it. But he tells them, look, I'm telling you so that something greater than the temple is here. And they're thinking, Jesus, I don't think there is anything greater than the temple. Like, have you seen how beautiful it is? People come from miles in every direction, hundreds of miles, just to see our temple. It's beautiful. And Jesus, this is the place where we do business with God. This is the place where we get right with God. And this is the system. And this is where we house the Torah. Jesus, the temple is everything. What do you mean? Something is greater than the temple. We don't even understand that. Now you're telling us that something is here? And Jesus is like, just wait. Just wait. Because one day it'll be obvious. One day it'll be clear. Just wait. Just wait. So, why is this important? I mean, why did I just spend the last few minutes talking to you about this? Here's why this is important. For those of you who don't consider yourself to be very religious, or for those of you who are struggling and you've left the faith, or those of you who may one day be tempted to leave the faith, or for those of you who may know somebody who's struggling religiously and they're not sure and they don't consider themselves a very religious person, or maybe for those of you who know or may one day know somebody who may be tempted to leave the faith, here's why all of this is important. Here's why this is important for all of us, okay? Because when we in those moments when we struggle with faith or we're tempted to leave the faith, chances are the reason why that's happening is because we are bumping into some of the old that Jesus came to bring an end to. That's why that's happening. For some of you, here's how it went for you. You ended up on a social media platform. And there was somebody on there that called themselves a Christian. And they presented an idea that you don't necessarily agree with, but they did it with absolutely no grace. They were rude, they were demeaning, and they called people names. And let's be honest, there was a part of that made you think, if that's what Jesus is about, I don't want any part of it. And I'm not excusing their behavior either, because I struggle when Christians do that too. But here's what I want you to know. That's part of the old that Jesus came to bring to an end. For others of you, here's how it happened for you. You ended up at maybe a church, or you found a group of people who were Christians. And they were fine with you as long as you looked like them, talked like them, acted like them, and voted like them. And the moment you didn't, they had problems with you. And you thought in the back of your mind, if that's what Jesus is about, I don't want any part of that. And I am not justifying their behavior. And I'm actually not even interested today in beating them up because getting rid of the old is hard to do. But in those moments when you found yourself amongst a group of people who called themselves Christians, and there was no grace, and there was rules orientation to their faith, and there was this sense of legalism, what I want you to know is that what you bumped into is some of the old that Jesus came to replace. He came to put an end to that. For others of you, here's how it happened. You were reading somewhere in your Old Testament, and there was some weird stuff in there that you didn't understand. You started reading about animal sacrifices and all this kind of stuff, and then you started reading about how it says that you can't have a garment of two different types of fabrics, and you can't sow two different types of seeds in your field, and you bumped into stuff in there that quite frankly is confusing and doesn't make sense and hard to reconcile. And what I want you to know, what you bumped into was some of the old that Jesus came to bring an end to. Now, don't get me wrong. Please don't mishear me. Old Testament's important. We should read it. We should study it. We should try our best to understand it, right? But there are parts of it that Jesus, the sacrificial system and some of the ways of encountering God and all of that Jesus came to bring an end to, and that's some of the old that you bumped into. For others of you, here's how it went. You bumped into somebody, or you came across somebody who was in a position of power, who was a Christian, or at least they claimed to be. But they almost wielded that as a tool to get people to do what they wanted them to do. And many things that they did, you thought to yourself, man, those don't even seem very Christian. And if that's what Jesus is about, I don't want any part of that. And what I want you to know is that in those moments, what you did was you bumped into some of the old that Jesus came to replace and end. For others of you, it might have happened this way. You just got sick and tired of people who called themselves Christians gathering together constantly to study the Bible and talk about all these things we should do and have no action. And I want you to know if that's the thing you bumped into some of the old that Jesus came to bring to an end. See, because here's the thing. I would like to almost beg you, if you're struggling with faith, or you're thinking about leaving the faith, or maybe you one day may be tempted to leave the faith, I would like to beg you not to allow people who still hold on to some of the old that Jesus came to bring an end to. Please don't allow those moments and those people to derail you from the thing that Jesus invites you into. Because the new that Jesus came to bring, here's what it is. Here's all that it is. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. The whole thing revolves around him and his very simple invitation, just follow me, just follow me, just follow me. Don't allow people who hang on to the old and haven't learned to let go of it yet. Please don't allow them to derail your faith. Because it's not what you're being invited into by Jesus. It's all about Jesus, just Jesus alone. Follow me, follow me, follow me. And here's the thing. Here's why I don't want you to do this. Here's why I'm begging you not to get derailed. Because in the first century, Jesus' followers went out with a very simple message that Jesus, the one that this whole thing is about, went into the world and he paid the ultimate sacrifice for everybody. And that all he's inviting us to do is just follow him. And it was so powerful that 350 years later, Christianity is the official religion in the Roman Empire. And that's not even the whole story. Listen, 2,000 years later, we are gathered here on this place, and there are churches like ours all over the country and all over the world that are celebrating Jesus. Because it was only and always about him and his invitation to come. And here's the thing, it was so irresistible. It was so irresistible. The new that Jesus invites us to is so irresistible. And when we push away the old and we stay focused on Jesus, it changes everything. So don't allow people who haven't quite yet learned to let go of the old derail you from the new that Jesus invited us into, because it changes everything. Instead, I want to invite you to come back next week, where I'm going to tell you more about the new that Jesus invites us into.